Hello, my name is Josh Kavensky. I'm a reporter at TPM and co-host of The Social Club, and I'm here with Joe Ragazzo. How's it going, Joe?
It's going good, Josh. I will admit it's kind of an interesting morning.
Oh, yeah?
Childcare fell through, so I have Sonny here. He's in the back sleeping. Hopefully, he stays asleep for the duration of the podcast. We'll
Otherwise,
see
we'll
that.
introduce him as a new character on the show. A
Yes,
new, yeah,
yes.
special guest appearance. How old is Sonny right now?
He is going to be 10 months old
All right.
on Saturday, actually.
Well,
So
at TPM, people achieve great things at a young age. So I don't think that'll impair him.
that's true.
Yeah, and maybe he can be assisted in whatever he achieves through AI.
Maybe
Yeah.
he'll probably be more adept at it than we are. Um, If our guest Leif Weatherby had something to say about it, I'd assume he would say it's going to affect how he culturally understands the world we inhabit.
Yeah, but we Leaf was great. We had a really great Joe and I had a really great conversation with him. What did you I mean, I found the whole thing really interesting. I think we could have talked all day. I just learned a ton about kind of like the mechanics of how AI works, just how like these language models are built. There was one thing he was talking about at one point about how like in the same way they don't understand how the brain kind of like certain parts of the brain produce certain sort of like elements of your personality or language, like the interconnectivity. They don't understand the same thing about AI models. Like,
That
how,
shocked me. I didn't
yeah,
know that. Yeah. Yeah, that was shocking. I didn't realize that we didn't totally understand like how things were being spit out.
right.
I think my what was my favorite part about the conversation? I think just generally thinking and talking through AI from the humanities side of things was fun because I feel like that's kind of missing a bit from the public conversation. Sort of like let's take a step back. Like what is language? Like what is culture? How does it work? How do humans create it and shape it? And like how does AI fit into it? Rather than having sort of these stodgy, repetitive conversations that you see everywhere about like, is AI good? Is AI bad? And sort of just like, well, what's going on right now, and what does it mean for humanity?
Right. That was really helpful. And he had, I mean, the whole idea that he had of cultural AI, with it kind of being integrated, yeah, into the culture and helping it, people kind of reproduce ideas and ways of going about their lives was really interesting. And it was a much more like nuanced idea where it's not like Terminator, hunting us,
Yeah,
like, it's not like robots hunting us down. It's just that it's sort of like in the fabric of everything we do.
yeah,
And it, like,
absolutely.
affects us in these ways we don't necessarily understand, which I thought was really, really cool.
Yeah, and his background in languages and in German, I think, come through because I think the way
Yeah.
we're thinking about AI right now is inextricably linked to language because that's how it's being trained, right? And so um the relationship between the language it's being trained on and how it spits out and then the language we're actually using is really interesting. He made a point that I'll be thinking about, which is AI is trained on text, and it would be different if it was trained by hearing things, because people speak different and the structure of language is different and those have real world um, consequences. So there's a lot here. I mean, there's really I think I might have to like listen back to our own podcast because I want to hear what Leaf said and think about it more. It was that interesting and that sort of there's a lot to latch on to, I think.
And he also gave some good movie and sports recommendations at the end.
Yes.
So there's that too, if you want to listen all the way through, which we hope
Yeah.
you do,
Yes.
because it was a great
Yes.
conversation. And yeah, please enjoy. Well, we're excited to have today Leif Weatherby joining us. He's an associate professor of German and director of the Digital Theory Lab at NYU. Thanks for coming, Leif. We really are excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Leaf,
Yeah.
we asked you on to talk about AI, but a listener who's unfamiliar with your work might wonder why, considering you're a professor of German, and if they Google you, they might see articles about Aaron Rodgers or analytics in the NFL. So,
Yeah.
where does the interest and the research into AI fit in? Like, how does that come about?
Yeah. Yeah. I have to say this at the beginning of all my classes too. Like, like I'm in the German department. I swear, and um, so there's two things I would say. One is like, biographically, I did a degree in comparative literature where we just study a lot of what's called literary theory, philosophy, history of aesthetics, stuff like that, cultural criticism, and and then I specialized in German partly because German has, and it's not even close, the deepest, most fascinating philosophical tradition, especially when it comes to thinking about technology and thinking about. So I study this long period from like the Industrial Revolution to the present, where you have everybody from Enlightenment and Romantics down to the present, where there are media theorists of various kinds, trying to think about like what does it mean for humans to live in a world that is basically built. What does it mean for humans to live in a world that is now quantitatively built, where we have models and anticipating our behaviors and all these kinds of things? And the depth of the German tradition for thinking about those things is incomparable. So I don't do what I guess if you know what a German department is, and I don't think everybody does, you might think that we study German culture, and that's true. I study the history of German culture, but more I come out of the history of German thinking in this way. And so I'm coming out of that and trying to bring it to the world as we live in it today. And as far as AI goes, there's like boring biographical ways to describe that. But the more important thing I would say is like now we live in a world where AI is cultural. It is a cultural condition. What are we dealing with right now? Massive walls of text that we have to cope with that are coming out of AI systems, and people are fighting about them and they're reading them and they're arguing about it and they're weird, and we get these images and we get the Trump administration like is basically an influencer cabinet that is just using generative AI to like perpetuate like YouTube following and stuff like that. And I'm like, we should be in there. This is what the humanities does. That's my feeling about it. And so I want to be in that, in all of that, because that's what I believe this is for. And should we also be doing historical and close in reading? And of course, yeah. Otherwise, we don't come from anywhere. But that's what I really feel like, it has to be brought into the present, into the public, into this kind of way. And so, even as broad as I think the NFL thing is just, I like football. I wanted to write about it. It's very personal for me, But
Yeah.
it coincides, So I'm trying to do some writing that's not so academic.
Okay. And was there like a moment when you realized that AI was going to be something that you wanted to kind of just like figure out? I mean, when was it that it went from being maybe something that was like kind of just talked about like in the ether of like the tech press to something that was really
Yeah.
like, okay, we need to like reckon with
Well, I
this?
have this group at NYU that I said, the Digital Theory Lab, and we started up in 2018. But I think the moment where I felt like it was popping out of that academic framework for me, was like 2020 or 2021. It was when GPT-2 was released by OpenAI. And they did this thing where they were like, we're not going to tell everybody the weights. It's too dangerous a technology. And at that time, like, people were laughing at them at conferences and stuff. They were just like this ridiculous company. But I thought they put out, this is in the book too, but like they put out like a test. Yeah, it was kind of like a exemplary text that GPT-2 had done, and it was like a fictional science reporting article about biologists had discovered unicorns in the Andes Mountains in South America. And it was just so good. Like, I was like, it just like, it blew my mind, because I was like, all of natural language processing, and I don't think that that is an exaggeration. Everybody who had thought about this stuff was trying to build it from this very low level. Can we make a sentence right? Can we get a machine to say, when you say this in a sentence, can we get a machine to recognize that it means this noun and not that noun that it's referring to, like pronouns, whatever, very small objects. You can understand why you would want to do that. You would think like language is built up that way. Suddenly, without starting there, GPT-2 was grabbing science reporting article. Think about all the things that happen in a science reporting article. You're quoting somebody, you're talking about who they are in the real world, you're moving back and forth between these frames, and you're talking about fucking unicorns in this case. And I was like, this is wild. And it had some mistakes at that lower level, but I was like, it grabbed this very large object. And that's how I see AI in general, is like it. I actually would say AI in general. I should say only large language models for this purpose, but like it picks up these massively large cultural objects, these patterns, and it grabs them at a level of fidelity and flexibility that we're very unused to seeing, and it works backwards from there. So in a way, it's like there's this mismatch between what we expect from computers in a more general sense and what we're getting from AI. And I think that's a lot of what we're all fighting about and, like worried about and so on.
Can you expand on that? I mean, when you're talking about the directionality from, building up from sentences up to like complex ideas versus AI just grabbing things, being able to break it down and understand it and like and compute it on some level, I don't know, it kind of reminds me about when, and I don't know much about uh quantum mechanics at all, but it kind of reminds me of when I hear about quantum mechanics and they talk about the difference of like moving linearly versus being able to do a bunch of different things at one time. And what I hear is just some system challenging the way humans think, right? You could just boil it all down to that. Like AI is challenging the way in which like we can understand the world. And I think that brings me back to your book, which I'd like to hear you talk about two ideas like that. Let me give the title of the book to the listeners real quick. Language Machines, Cultural AI, and the End of Remainder Humanism. And I think it'd be great if you could explain what you mean by cultural AI and what you mean by remainder humanism, because I think they tie into what you're just discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, on the cultural side, that is kind of the thesis, is like I think that, so AI as a field, there's a lot of really complex history to AI. It's all super interesting, but as a field, AI grew up together with this field called cognitive science. And cognitive science is not like there's not usually a department of cognitive science. Cognitive science is a loose understanding between a bunch of different fields: biology, philosophy, psychology, neuroscience. Like there's, but the idea is to study like how the mind works. So in various ways, right? And cognitive science wants to understand how human minds work, and AI was this other discipline that came up with it, that was like, maybe the best way to understand how minds work is if we build one. It's kind of a harebrained notion at some level, right? But it's very interesting. And the if you look at the history of the way that people think about consciousness and what we're doing when we have a mind, right? Um, One way that they go about it is that they say, like, well, humans developed these, right, in the course of evolution at some point. And fundamentally, humans do two different things. One is they have this ability to understand the world, to speak language, to do math, right, to do all these like impressive things. And then the other thing that we do, which is really different from other animals, is that we have things that aren't strictly speaking like brain capacities in this way, but we hand them down from generation to generation. And that's what you call culture: the
Hmm.
transmission of knowledge, customs, practices, habits, right? Like, like, what's your hat? Is that
The
a
New
net?
York Liberty.
The New York Liberty. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know about that particular case. It's a young league, but it's like, like I have a friend who's like, like you think about like the Pope is a White Sox fan, right?
Yeah.
And that's inherited, but
Yeah.
not biologically, right? It's cultural inheritance, right?
Yeah.
So like I think like I was like, I just kind of was like trying to polemically say, all these guys wanted to build a mind, and they got a culture instead. They captured the stuff that we do in language rather than like it's not the same as us in this way. It doesn't do it the way we do it, and it's not actually modeling the mind. It's modeling culture in this bigger sense. And that's very weird and very uncanny. Like,
Yeah.
like when you encounter those things, it's like you see this constantly. Like Richard Dawkins just did it, where there's like some guy who's like, hey, I think this thing is alive, or I think this thing is sentient, or whatever. And I'm like, this is because you don't understand what culture is. And there's a good
Mhm.
reason for that. We don't naturally understand what culture is. We know how to navigate, we know how to be a fan, but the humanities is all about thinking, like, what does it mean to be a fan? right?
Hmm.
Like, how did, that kind of a question. So that's the cultural AI side. The remainder humanism thing was just something that I kind of got picked up, and I don't know if it was meant to be all that big a deal, but I was just trying to say, like, whenever a computer does something, it gets good at math. You have the invention of the calculator. People will say, well, that's not the essence of humanity anyway. That's okay. Then the computer gets good at, image recognition of some kind. In the teens, we had these classificatory algorithms. They were also this kind of AI, but they're very different from generative AI. But they were able to, like, recognize the difference between a tumor and a shadow on a CT scan better than a radiographer could.
Mm-hmm.
But people would say, yeah, but being a trained radiographer is not the essence of being human, right? So I would say this is a remainder humanism. We're painting ourselves into a corner, just going like, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. And then comes the language machine, and
Yeah.
everybody's like, oh, well, we can't say
Yeah.
we're not
Yeah.
the animal that has language. We can't say that language isn't the essence of humanity, because we've been saying that for thousands of years,
Yeah. It's
right? In
almost like
philosophy and all these discourses. So anyway, yeah, sorry,
it's
go
like a
ahead.
weird version
Yeah,
of the no true Scotsman problem. It's not quite that, but it's like trying to,
yeah,
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 like what are we if we're saying that thing has it too? I have
yeah.
one quick story, and then we'll get back. Uh, so I at my senior seminar, I think it was a senior seminar, it was in philosophy of cognitive science, and
Oh, cool. Yeah, yeah.
I have to tell you this joke because I rarely meet people that might even get the joke. But I had this professor, and we were reading this text by Alvin Noe. I don't know if you know
Oh,
Alvin Noe,
yeah.
and
I know who he is. Yeah, I've read him.
yeah, and he
Yeah.
wrote a book at the time called Out of Our Heads, about how we, like, how do we actually perceive things. And my professor stood at the class, and he didn't like Alvin Noe's book, and so he says out of our heads, more like out of his mind. and
That's a
and the
philosophy professor for you
yeah,
right
and
there. Yeah,
all the students kind of
absolutely.
like looked at each other and like smirked, like, how about this guy?
That's
Yeah, so
amazing.
all right,
That's amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Well, I mean, that's the fun thing about that area is, like, they sound more harebrained than any, crazy, clove smoking French theorists
Yeah,
ever. They're like, what if what if minds are circuits? What
yeah,
if minds
right.
are computers? And I'm like, why was that not calculated as, like, the hippy dippy granola weirdo thing?
Yeah,
Just because there's a computer, like, that's, anyway. Yeah, that
yeah.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, talking about cultural AI, I feel like I'm totally with you on, like, it just kind of being everywhere, and I've become allergic to all of these, like, phrases that I see. So there's certain constructions that are so kind of like common to, like, ChatGPT or Claude or whichever the model is, right? Like, it's not X, it's
Oh,
Y,
yeah, yeah,
or,
yeah.
like, this, like, these, like, really short sort of like staccato ways of, like, describing something. And I see it and I just get, like, so angry for no reason.
Yeah.
And I, like, don't entirely know why it, like, pisses me off so much to see that, other than, like, it, you can, like, kind of viscerally sense that it's from a robot, and so it's, like, unnatural. But you kind of go further, it seems like, and make this point that it might start reshaping the way people think. And I'm curious, how deep do you think that's going to go? I mean, do you think this really is going to start replicating culture in a way where people aren't necessarily aware of, like, how AI is shaping how they think and how they interact with one another?
Yeah, I think those it's it is kind of interesting. Like, almost certainly, the types of things that it's doing that are typical, that are slightly atypical for human writing, human communication, the vast majority of them are not getting noticed, is my guess. And we pick these ones out. We have this tendency, right, to, like, pick out prototypical examples and say, like, here's the one. So now it's like, if you don't write, it's not just a m dash. It's a, you know what I mean? Like, um, if
Yeah.
you don't write that way, the idea is, like, you're a little bit safe. This is remainder humanism to me, right? Like I see a tendency. I'm not going to name names, but I see a tendency in the world of, like, Substack. There's a lot of creative writing happening in New York City. There's all these little literary magazines operating, which are really fun and interesting. I do see a tendency where people are trying to flee from the internet in their prose. They're trying to get away from it. And I feel like the AI thing just brings it to a head. Like, there was a generation of novelists. They're still pretty young, but, like, there was a generation of novels that were like internet novels. They were like social media novels. I can't. I hate them. I can't do it. But almost across the board. But they were trying to like absorb that language and naturalize it, and you know what I mean. And now I see the opposite tendency. It's like people fleeing, and I think that, but they're fleeing from stuff that we humans have socially coded as being AI like, and they're not really fleeing the AI. That's how I see it. So, like, I think that the issue is that language itself and culture itself are dynamic. They do change, right? And we hate it when they change sometimes, right? Like, there's a known thing in linguistics, which is that um, young teenage girls are a major driver and have been for like centuries of lexical change. Like the slang of young teenage girls for a really long time, longer than you would think, has been super important for the way that language changes generation on generation. And of course, eventually, you know, some terms get picked out and they get circulated too heavily, and then we hate them, like anything that's too popular. Like right now, I think maxing is probably hit its peak, mogging, you know, that kind of stuff, you know. But this is normal, right? And underneath those changes that we notice, everything is changing anyway all the time. And I think AI, the thing that I really dislike about the skeptics of AI on the language axis is that they don't seem to get this point. So they don't see that that the AI language is actually like genuinely connected to ours. Or I would just say like that's all one thing, that's language. And so yeah, I do think changes happen, but I think it's hard to register them. Linguistics has a tough time. Like, how would you quantify it? You know, and if you did, you know, how, you know, we get these qualitative understandings, but then it's like, so we do have certain words, we have certain ticks in language and so on, and people get upset about those. But I don't know. I also see the opposite thing happening, which where like people really want to read human generated writing. They don't mind using an AI bot for occasional stuff, you know. It's fine if you're using it to search and it tells you some answers and it's, you know, it's got like a little, you know, some little nice phrases or a good metaphor or whatever. But when people suspect that on Substack or in the New York Times they're reading something that is generated by AI, the social calculation is absolutely not. And I think that's a really interesting, a more general version of that that isn't just in the prose, because I think at the linguistic level, it's really interesting what's happening there. And I don't think it will control us in any way. I just think that, you know, it's a big shift in how we think about and use language. And that's
Sort
pretty,
of reminds me of text messaging, which I think it has definitely affected how we use language.
yeah.
From, I mean, you every once in a while you run into someone who says "LOL" like out loud, like in real
Yeah.
life, or
LMAO.
yeah, or like the way in which emojis have like replaced alphabetized language in communication, or even just like being able to respond to a message with like a thumbs up, right? I mean, that's like a
Yeah.
whole new kind of communication that didn't exist before. You couldn't do that really another way. It reminds me of that. It's a prescriptivist nightmare, really. Like the
Yeah.
idea with
I
AI
mean,
like, changing syntax structures and stuff.
I totally agree with that. And like the way that they got these to chat is by giving them like an explicit script. You should chat, basically, you know, like um, there's a whole complex story of how that happens, you know, leading up to ChatGPT. But the reason they can chat, I think, is that one of the basic things that they're trained on is an enormous amount of live textual exchange of that kind, Reddit, social media of other kinds, and so on. And what you get there is it's kind of like oral language. It's in real time, but it's through the medium of text, and you get emojis, and you get something that really doesn't exist before like the 1980s, which is like
Hmm.
real time textual conversation exchange. I don't think
That's
you
in,
could have this form of generative AI. I don't think it would work as a chat bot if you didn't have that. I think you could use it for other text, you know, purposes, but
It's an
it
interesting
needs
idea.
to have that.
I
Yeah,
had never really thought of that, but like in a thought experiment, if you were able to train AI, if you had two AIs and one was like only trained on text, and
yeah,
then the other one somehow only heard, like
yeah,
I obviously like it's going to translate it into text anyway, but like if it only learned from the way people talk versus the way people write, you're going
yeah,
to end up with two totally different
yeah,
models, really. And
yeah.
I that's interesting. I had never thought about that.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of idea was out there for in there's a book by there's a Stanford professor named Xiaochang Li who has a book about that early those early attempts to model language that were mostly sonic because they were working with like telephones, you know. But
Mm.
this is basically predates like like web bulletin boards. Web bulletin boards in the 80s are the I think the big change because you get a totally different kind of text. And I was trying to visualize this the other day. The amount of text data that exists, the amount of data that exists in general, but the amount of text data that exists, if you if you try to graph it from like in all of human history since we invented writing to the present, it start like the curve is just flat. It's basically a flat line until like 2005. And then the line is vertical, like
Wow.
really vertical, not like, you know, and it is there is no end in sight. I read recently that last year 6 million books were published, which is like orders of magnitude higher in the on the whole globe than ever before. And they think there is a lot of generated text in those now, but they think 600,000 were published by humans, like written by humans. And that too is like orders of magnitude higher than any previous year on record. So
Hmm.
it just is. I think there's a sense in which everybody hates the idea of this much text existing. It just feels like a great weight on our shoulders
Well, it
somehow,
feels
you
like
know?
there's a lot of
Yeah.
text, but also the text that we want is kinda disappearing, like, you just worry
Yeah,
about,
yeah, yeah,
news
yeah.
sites
And
disappearing,
nobody
so
reads, right? Like we have
yeah,
the
right.
illiteracy crisis. Nobody reads. And it's like,
Yeah,
yeah, but we all are just like, you know, I
yeah.
was, Travis Kelsey said when he was on SNL that it was hard for him to be on SNL because he couldn't read the cue cards.
Well, a
And
lot
there
of
were lots of
hipsters
jokes
there, but
about that, but I was thinking that's kind of interesting because Travis Kelsey is like super smart.
yeah,
Like, like he's credited with like really key strategic decisions that have led to some of those Chiefs Super Bowls. And he's dragging his eyes across text all the time, diagrams and text and so on, because football players are like forced into this really intense media scenario constantly. So there's something really interesting going on there. I don't buy the illiteracy crisis as such. I think something more interesting is going on. Anyway,
mm,
yeah.
I mean, what do you think that is? I'm curious because just like in my day to day life, I think I mean it like rings kind of true that people read
Yeah.
less, right? Like
Yeah,
it's like you
yeah.
just don't see people. Like I feel like when I'm on the subway in New York, like everybody in the car is just on their phone, like scrolling. It's not like
Yeah.
every now and then you see people like reading some novel, but it's not that, right? But
Yeah.
what do you
And
think?
they're
Like, what do you
definitely
think?
they're
Yeah,
they're definitely like reading on their phone, right?
right. Like
There's
it's a
or they're
form of
see they're
literacy.
seeing text. Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
thing. I mean, I agree that book reading is definitely taking a hit. I see different numbers. I don't know how to construe them exactly, and I also see that there's a resurgence of interest. I also think there's like a lot of people are there's a huge demand for long form fiction. People are like, like what is selling the most in publishing is I think Danielle Steele is pumping out like 20 books a year. And like,
yeah, yeah,
there are these fantasy writers and it's like, people want to be immersed in text, but they are forced to be not immersed, but surrounded by walls of text all the time, like on their phones and whatever. Even when you watch like slop videos, there usually is alt text there, right? Like
yeah,
it's everything is subtitled now,
yeah,
so you're just like seeing text all the time. And the thing that Kelsey thing made me think was you're seeing it, but you're not always processing the words as symbols. And I
yeah,
think what we think about literacy is that you should be cognitively tuned into words in like a sequence such that you have like an imagination of what they mean, and that fiction trains you to do that, and people are no longer trained, especially at high school level, we're no longer trained to read long form fiction in that way. So there's a change with the way that we process text at all kinds of different levels. I mean, I understand why people would call that illiteracy. I do,
yeah.
but I also think something interesting is going on there because it's very weird to think of a period of illiteracy being accompanied by an unprecedented amount of text and an unprecedented amount of. I guess if you want to say it's not reading, it's fine, but it's like you're still seeing like books worth of text every day. That's pretty wild.
I want the AI and these large language models are obviously so dependent on language and the rules of language, and most of them, to my knowledge, are being developed in the United States or China. And you look at certain languages, obviously they're very different from each other. There are some languages with, like, we have subject, verb, direct, object, or that's what I'm talking about to the readers. And then there's other languages where it's total opposite order. And I'm curious
Yeah.
if how that affects this cultural creation that you're talking about. Like, is there the potential for flattening culture because ultimately people are not communicating with could communicate less with like words and sentences and more with images and memes and stuff like that? Or am I not even thinking about it the right way? Or like, what's the interplay between language structure and AI culture creation,
I
if
mean,
there is one? Maybe
I
there
think
isn't
we
one.
have to keep communicating with language. I don't think we're going to get around that. Um, that's a really that's a really interesting question because like so the internet itself, if you think of like how they're trained as being on the whole internet, which is what's usually said, it's more complicated than that. But you can't get the whole internet. But also now they're being trained on many more tokens than exist on the internet. I think um, trillions of tokens. It's like these are really massive data sets. But I'm trying to think about how to say this. And technically, what happens is before you train on the text, you have to embed a vocabulary. So you create like it's called word embedding or subword embedding, tokenization. You basically create a huge vocabulary, which is like in some modern models, it's like 150,000 subwords, and the words are not all. Um, some of them are like normal English words, think or whatever the Chinese equivalent is, right? Like you will have those. Um, and then some of them will be like a section of a word like ing or like something that doesn't feel like it should be useful, ilp or something like that, or some
So
like
not even like
this is how
phonemes and
this is how
just like,
code. No, they're not phonemes. They're not sound related. It's all text. So it's like
okay.
there's also be like snippets of not snippets, but like pieces of code syntax stuff like that. That's
Oh,
why they're good at coding. And then because you have a massive amount of code on the internet, right? So like so you have this massive vocabulary, and I think I kind of agree. It looks when you look at it as though it's like chopped up English and Chinese for the most part. I think there's definitely other languages natively represented in there. But the weird thing about it is that like for example, I don't think I could be wrong, but I don't think like every model at least has like a chunk of the vocabulary that looks German. But they're really good at German. And if you look at how they do it, they just break the words down in ways that you would never do. So like you have, German famously has long words, right? And
mhm.
like you if you look at how the word is built, like underneath in the code, you can see that it's like strung together out of like weird strings that it adds up to the word, but the strings don't make sense from a German's perspective or a German speaker's perspective. So it's really interesting because you've basically taken this massive amount of text data, you've chopped it up in this weird way that is totally counterintuitive and has nothing to do with human speech, and then you've recreated basically all the languages in the world. Or an ability to speak in all these languages in the world, and then on top of that to speak with relevance, in a chat format of all these languages in the world, but you're building it out of pieces that don't really make sense. Well, one thing I would say about this is that we don't really know how humans do that exactly either.
Mm.
We do have the idea of phonemes, but there's an interface between like I guess there's an area of neurolinguistics, but neuroscience is not far enough along to help us understand how we cross the barrier from those sounds to the meanings.
Yeah.
And so we just don't know how to do that. Similarly, we don't know how to cross the barrier from the output of AI back into the guts of the machine and understand why it's doing what it's doing from a meaning perspective.
Really? We don't I didn't know
We
that.
do
I
not
would
know how to
assume
do
they would
that.
be able to.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was a big article about this in the New York Times just a couple weeks ago. It's like the technical discipline that does that is called interpretability research, you know? And the idea is like we want to go down in there and find like where does it do word order and where does it do X and Y. And you can kind of see pieces of that, just like in the brain. You can say like, if I take out this chunk of my brain, I can't speak anymore or whatever.
Yeah.
But it doesn't explain it. And
Right.
so far, there's no paradigm in that research for. There's no neuroscience of AI, basically, not yet. And you can see you could. I mean, I'm not going to try to go into the details, but you can see why. I think it's like um, something holistic happens in the brain, something bigger, those bigger patterns that I was talking about before. And it happens in AI too. And we just don't know what the mechanisms are or whether you can isolate it to mechanisms. That seems to be a big problem. So, yeah.
Yeah, I saw something yesterday. It was a bunch of people who manage book warehouses, where just
Yeah.
like these textbooks that have been gathering dust for like 50 or 60 years,
Yeah.
they're all reporting that like these random companies are just like ordering these books that nobody's thought of for like forever en masse. And like the theory is that it's AI companies who want them to like integrate them into
Yeah.
LLMs, right?
There was some sort of
Um,
story about
yeah.
they like, maybe one of those companies bought like a bunch of those books, and then in order to avoid the copyright issues, they burned them afterwards. It's like,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, the whole thing, yeah, the copyright thing is crazy.
yeah,
I'm curious. You mentioned kind of the like earlier that when ChatGPT first came out, they were almost like advertising themselves with these claims of like apocalypse that like, this is gonna like, our technology is so powerful that this is gonna like replace all white collar jobs. It's gonna end the world, right? And I feel like
yeah.
those claims have not gone away. Like I feel like every week or so
No,
I see some like think piece about like how every white collar
yeah,
job is going to get replaced.
yeah.
I get there more on the humanities side of all this, but I'm curious. Like, I mean, do you think that's like a possible outcome? That like, or do you think that's overhyped? I'm curious how you think about that.
I think in general, when you hear these apocalyptic things, I think it plays on this expectation that people have. It's like if a company is saying that they're going to do something bad, you'd think they're being honest because they're speaking against their self interest. But especially Anthropic is guilty of the opposite thing where they use the threat as advertisement because they're
Mm.
saying this is
Right.
very powerful and the more powerful it gets, the more we're going to have to use it.
It's like,
Therefore, we should be the
we've
people to
developed
make
this,
it.
right. We've
Yes.
developed this tool
Yes.
that's like so powerful it's going to end the world. Like, why not buy our
Yes.
thing? Like,
And there's kind of a science fictional version of this that is super influential. Like OpenAI and Anthropic are two branches of this kind of, they came out of this ideology, which was um, tied to like a group in the valley called rationalists, and their idea is like this is gonna happen, and if it happens the wrong way, it could wipe us out. So, uh, so we need to get there first, so that we make sure it happens the right way. So that's this kind of like weird loop of rhetoric that they use, and it comes down into their marketing, and then they say this kind of stuff. Right now, I think that's taken over even in places where it's not particularly like rationalist flavored, and in these companies where they're basically saying like, yeah, but it does look like knowledge work is going to change massively. I do think that, I mean, like the internet and computers, and then the internet also changed knowledge work massively, right? And for sure, I mean, the way that software itself is developed is changing very quickly, and I think that's the case study that they're extrapolating from. So they're saying like, Clive Thompson had a really great thing in the New York Times Magazine a couple weeks back that was like about the process of relinquishing code writing internally to agents. These like agents are wrappers around large language models that allow them to interact directly with your computer so that you can do things with them rather than just chatting with them, right? and I do think that that's changing, and it's changing rapidly, and people have different views of it within the industry, like within the software industry. But the thing that I would say about this is the technical way that people talk about that, like creating an agent that can operate on software, that can write you a program, an app, right? Like say you need an app for, I don't know, regulating your, going to the gym and tracking your calories or something like that. You don't want to buy one, so you make one, right? You can vibe code an app like that, yes. When you're operating in the pipeline of software development, you're operating in a very tightly controlled context. And the way that engineers sometimes talk about this is like context engineering. So they say like we're going to set up these agents, we put them in, they call it a harness.
Yeah, I was talking to our developer
I
about
don't know
this
why we're
recently.
talking about. I don't know why that term is in there. It's like, is this swinger culture? I don't know what it
I
is.
don't know.
Like,
He
yeah,
kept dropping
yeah,
that Woz,
yeah, yeah,
Woz kept dropping harness in a meeting, and I was like,
yeah,
Woz, you need to
yeah,
stop and tell me what you're talking. What is a harness?
yeah. So they're talking about engineering the context. So they're like when you have an LLM write code, it it does it really fast and it does it really well up to a certain point. But when things get complex, it will create like spaghetti across the machine, right? Or across like a network. Um, it can also diagnose that faster than any human can. So you can see why people are gonna, But the idea is, and they've done big experiments on this at OpenAI and stuff, can we create a bureaucratic setting in a company where humans are running agents such that humans never touch code, but they steer the agents so that we don't end up with like a mess, right? Um, so software is the lowest level target for this problem, is what I want to say about it. The next level, and which has been being called the SaaS apocalypse, which would be great. If software as a service like disappeared as a term, that would be awesome. Like if whatever. But the next level up is like enterprise software is human facing on the enterprise and the consumer side, and there are humans associated with the software, like HR is the case, or it's like some forms of customer service, some forms even of sales are so completely softwareized that they're saying we think we could establish a sort of context engineered way of eliminating a lot of the inefficiency here, which by which they mean human labor, right? I do think some of that is possible because it is so completely softwareized already. So the context is kind of there, if that makes
Yeah,
sense. But when you think about anything beyond that, the context is not there. So my thing about this is like if your job is essentially just managing software, you should think about where else you might work. Like
yeah,
what other skill you might develop or whatever. But if your job is not essentially just managing software, you still should be aware of this, but I don't think I think the claim is overhyped for marketing purposes, and there is this bottleneck. I think it's a serious bottleneck. And at some point, it becomes a bottleneck that's just about human nature. Like, there's people saying in Silicon Valley, like, nobody needs the App Store anymore because you can just make your own app. And I'm like, the reason people don't make their own app is not because they don't have access to a tool that makes whatever app they want. It's because like humans have mimetic desire. Like, I have an app because you told me it was cool, and
yeah.
or like I have an app because like I'm not gonna make like a fantasy football app specifically for my league. That's stupid.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
what I mean? Like even if I could, like I don't want to design it. I don't even want to think about it. Like people don't want to do, so there's this meme out there of agency and being agentic, and you can just do things, and it's like, yeah, but I can only do so
Yeah.
many things. I'm only
Right.
awake for so long, like,
Yeah.
and they're like, but you can tell the agent to do it. And I'm like, that's like saying like if I had an assistant, I could do more writing. And I'm like, that's true up to a very limited point. And then it's like I have to actually can do the writing, right?
Yeah.
So, like I think there's a deep libertarianism in the way that Silicon Valley views social processes.
Yeah.
And in this case, I'm not even saying like I disagree with it. I'm just saying it's wrong
Yeah.
because it just dismisses institutions and bureaucracy out of hand. And I'm like, yeah, there are inefficiencies in those things, but they're not there for no reason at all. They're
I
there
think
because
there's
this is how humans live together.
I think tying that together with what you mentioned before with the rationalist, something an idea I'm kind of just like obsessed with is culturally you have that group of people, the rationalists in Silicon Valley in general, who I think truly believe that they are in possession of the objective truths about how the world works and operates, and that if we would just get out of their way, the rest of us, they could just organize everything and it would be right. And it all the things we've talked about today about how we don't even know how we work. Like we don't know how we create language really. We don't know how we understand the world. I mean, talking about German, I mean, going back to Kant, like, what can we really know anyway, right? Like what is even possible to know? Um but it does seem like obviously from the political landscape, it's troubling because this group of people have immense power, and they kind of try to take these their own confidences and like turn it into legislation and policy and economic.
Yeah.
Building data centers, for example, is an example
Right.
that we're going to need all these data centers.
Right.
Which I wanted to ask you about that. Again, I know you're on the humanities side, but do you spend much time thinking about the energy part of AI? Because sometimes it seems like a lot of the questions we debate are pointless because there's not enough energy to do what a lot of these promises would require. Like
Yeah.
estimates where you basically need another sun to
Yeah.
power some of these
Yeah.
AI dreams. So I'm curious how much you think about the energy side of things.
So I don't do a lot with it,
Hmm.
to be honest. So I'm going to dodge the question slightly by saying
Yeah.
it like this. Like it definitely seems to be the case that if you put a data center in a town, it doubles the electricity bills. Like there's
Hmm.
this directly negative effect. This happened before with cryptocurrency. If you do crypto mining in some small town, it really messes with the electrical grid, right?
Hmm.
I feel like a lot of the criticisms of AI in this way are underbaked, not because they're wrong in the directionally wrong, as people say, but like because they are saying AI is the problem, and usually if AI is, in my view, usually if AI is looks like the problem, the system underlying it is broken already.
Bingo.
So what bugs me about that data energy stuff is like we definitely need data processing, right? I think what's being commented on, what we want is some sort of like rational, good society version of like putting these in the right place and providing them, as a utility. And if you look at Texas, if you look at what utilities are like in this country, it's a fucking mess. I'm
Mhm.
sorry. I feel the same way about medicine. Like people are like, man, AI is going to be so dangerous, for medicine. And I'm like, it's kind of a spotty picture. Like, yes, it will definitely be used for the worst things that are already happening in medicine. It can also be used for charting and for radiography and stuff like that, where like you can see some positive uses. But the reason that we feel like, this is because that system is totally broken.
Mhm.
Medicine in the United States is broken as a system. And the way I worry about AI skeptic kind of stuff is that people come in and they say, what if we took away the AI? And I'm like, even if we did that, it would still be broken. Like
Mhm.
AI hasn't caused the clusterfuck of what it's like to deal with doctors in this country. Could it make it worse? Definitely.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then you have to kind of zoom out suddenly and go like, that's that's capitalism, right? Like,
Right. Right.
like
Right.
I'm
Right.
sorry, like that's I really don't
I
like
knew
to
we'd
be the
get
guy
there
who's like, it's
eventually.
just capitalism, stupid. But sometimes I feel like
Yeah.
people don't like that because it's often the right answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I really wonder like how
Just
much
shouldn't
of
be the
this, like,
last word. That's all.
right.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
like, I really wonder also like how much of the fear mongering is so effective just because we don't have a social safety net. So like, if you
oh
lose your
yeah,
job because of technological change, like
yeah,
that is just like you lose your livelihood in a way that like wouldn't happen if we had
totally,
like
totally.
stronger healthcare from the government or like better unemployment
And
insurance.
by the way, going back to just like the question about German and the long history stuff,
Yeah,
like the first person who really said that about like the off marketing of jobs that were get automated and then whatever was David Ricardo in the 1820s.
Mm,
Like this isn't a new problem.
yeah.
Automation as a partial process that disaligns skills from markets and employment and then realigns them in new ways. That's normal in capitalism. So this is something I think that I really struggle with that. There I do wonder about the illiteracy crisis. Like people don't seem to grasp uh, historical ideological formations in ways that like make it possible for you to say it looks like to me like this will happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And then
heard
people say, well, you're not good at predicting because you're not using a predictive analytics setting or whatever. And I'm like, it's not about prediction. It's about this is clearly a pitfall.
yeah.
It's about a possible thing, along an arc that we're all unfortunately living.
I
it's
think
not
the
a
idea
prediction;
of
it's a pitfall.
I
Yeah,
think the idea of imagining like a different economic and a different socioeconomic system for most people is so impossible that they don't grapple with it. Like we're not going to change a whole system, so we can only move the pieces within it, which is, an erroneous way of thinking. But I don't even think it occurs to them. Like that, the idea of dismantling capitalism or something like that is like the Matterhorn, like falling into the ocean or something like that to a lot of people, I think, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate. I wanted to, we're at about 45 minutes, so I need to get into some football stuff here because
Yeah. Oh,
your
good.
article on your article about analytics was it like hit the spot. I mean, this has been like an ongoing subject in group chats with my friends for years about basically like obviously data and stats are helpful and analytics can be helpful if used correctly, but just increasingly I'm not really sure that that's the case and it's overinflation.
Yeah.
So can you
Yeah.
I'll just let you set up that article and what you wrote about, because I thought it was just
I think I
phenomenal.
wrote about it twice. Was this the one about the
The
Kyle
one in the
Shanahan
Baffler
coaching
about
tree or
yes,
the
yes,
yeah,
yes, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Football guys.
Like the nerd coaches,
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Um, like Mike McDaniel.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You gotta love him. So not when he's the coach of the Finns, but whatever. Yeah. Uh, I was recently going back to this book. It was a pretty influential book from 2003 by James Surowiecki. I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's called The Wisdom of Crowds, and there's a
Yeah.
whole section in there about going for it on fourth down. And it's exactly the same debate that we're having now, except that in the interim. So there was this company. There is this company, Pro Football Focus, and it has a really interesting history. I wrote a separate thing about there's somebody a review of a book. This guy,
Mm,
this I think he's a Vikings reporter, wrote a really interesting biography of the company. And they started like it was like a British guy, which is pretty wild, who
mm,
started like thinking that you could do what baseball had done for almost 100 years, like sabermetrics, by breaking down plays into data and then using that data right to think about like are there things that we're under exploiting, are there whatever. One of the things that came out of all that for me, and so Mike Shanahan, the Super Bowl winning coach of the Niners and the Broncos, his son, who runs an offense that is derived from his father's offense, Kyle Shanahan, who's the current coach of the 49ers, his coaching tree, which includes Sean McVay and Kevin O'Connell, and like it's like half the league at this point, right? Well, there's been a lot of shifting after this last year, whatever. They are like heavily, heavily analytics oriented. And I mean, I think it's more than that. I think they're also there. It's a younger group. It's like if you think of the John Madden football coach type, right?
yeah.
This is a very different thing. I saw Sean McVay the other day and I was like, is this dude getting plastic surgery? Like,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
and you can't
they look good.
imagine like Dick Butkus with, getting fillers, right? Like, that's
Yeah.
not like an imaginable thing. So, like, the masculinity has changed, the way that people think has changed, right? And part of that story is analytics. And the analytics is really interesting also because now it's been integrated, and AI is in there now too, although I don't know
Yeah.
exactly how, but like, it's been integrated in such an intense way that like I mean, we're just used to it now. You see Josh Allen get off the field and he's immediately on his iPad. So
Yeah.
he's reviewing what's happening, So trying to think which one I think Mike McDaniel was for some time a quality control coach. The quality control coach basically just watches the game from the booth and then goes down at halftime and tells the offensive, or I guess they're up there, the offensive and defensive coordinators, how close they are to their desired ratio of run to pass plays, or how close the other team is to that
Mm,
50-50 split or whatever. So there's an element of trying to, it's like World War II cryptography. Turing solves the Enigma machine, and so the British know where the Germans are, where the U-boats are, but they can't reveal that they know that. So this becomes like this, like, meta game, and the strategy is all baked in there. So for me, like, the story is less about like, is it right? Should you go for it on fourth down? I don't think any of those things are provable. What's interesting to me about it is it gives the game this added, very weird, very cerebral, very intellectual layer that I find fascinating, and which I guess it was Sunday Night Football. I can't remember the name of the guy, but he was the showrunner for Sunday Night Football. He adopted it pretty early, and I think he did something interesting with it where he was like, this can be fun. So I have a thing where, like, several years ago, I went out to the Meadowlands to see the Bills and the Jets. And I was sitting, I was in nosebleeds. And I was just like, this sucks.
Yeah.
Where's my data? Like, I was like, I don't even know who caught the ball down there. Like,
Yeah.
but more, I was like, I suddenly, my grandfather used to watch football with no sound on. He didn't want the announcers even, and now I'm addicted to, like, like in situations where,
Yeah.
So I think it's a fascinating change in the presentation of it. It's definitely a part of data culture, part of fan culture. You can't have an argument about football without referring to PFF stats. You can't say that, I don't know, like, you think Shedeur Sanders is going to be great for the Browns. You can't
you
say
can't say
that. You have to say that the DVOA of the offense of the Browns over the last 8 games of the season when he was started, whatever, So, yeah. So it's a big change, I think, in the culture of sports and, well, football. It's not a new for baseball, at a certain point. Yeah. But it's spread all across the. I talked to some guys recently on a different podcast about soccer analytics in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
And we were having this AI conversation about it. And I didn't know that had even started to happen, because I don't know how you would analyze. I don't know how you would data find soccer. But yeah,
soccer analytics from I don't watch a lot of soccer, but my friend was telling me about this, and it's all about, like, movement. On understanding how players move and things, and I understood it. Yeah, and I still don't really understand. I can't even explain it. He just kept saying movement over and over and over again.
I feel the same way about, like, the Stanley Cup playoffs. Like when you watch hockey, it's like you're watching people play Go. Like, it's like this, like, like, the patterns are not predictable. Yeah. Football and baseball, every play starts the same way.
Yeah.
Everybody has to line up almost the same way, right? Like,
you
can move your the shift is banned. You can move a little bit in the outfield, and you can line up different combinations of players in the backfield. But, but every play starts at a time, both, you know what I mean? And that's just not the case in these continuous sports like basketball and hockey and soccer. Yeah.
I think, like, AI has appeared in so many books and movies over the years. Is there any one that, like, really captures your idea of, like, cultural AI? Like, how it's I'm curious if there's anything that we could, like, watch or listen to.
I would crowdsource this, because, like, science fiction is so big and so wide, I'll do the German thing, okay?
Okay.
The new cinema German director Rainer Werner Fassbinder, made a movie called World on a Wire, which is about, it's kind of one of the sources for the Matrix, but instead of the AI being used to, like, siphon energy out of human bodies, which is the premise of the Matrix, the simulated world is being used to siphon opinions, like survey opinion and data, like polling kind of data out of, like, this simulated world. I think that one is really good. I think it's so that's one that comes to mind offhand.
That's great.
Right,
we'll check that
listeners,
out.
Viewers, let us know other AI in the comments.
Absolutely.
I think my personal favorite AI movie was, I'm certainly forgetting some, but Her. I think about Her all the time.
Yeah,
I love that movie when it came out, and it feels more prescient, like, all the time. I have to revisit that one soon.
Yeah, there was that whole flap with OpenAI where they asked Scarlett Johansson if she would voice their models, and she said no. And then what they actually did was that they used a different actress who sounds like Scarlett Johansson, who said yes. But people assumed that they had synthesized Scarlett Johansson's voice. So there was this, like, weird, even that was, like, like, people have fights about AI where the actual thing that's being fought about isn't real. And I think that's like that is kind of science fictional, right? I don't know. All of the stuff with it is, like, it is science fictional, but the science fiction is not Terminator the way that those rationalist guys are, turning everybody into paper clips or whatever. It's more just like, the most egregiously boring science fiction you can possibly imagine, it's more like Kafka. But real Kafka, like, Kafka is all about this kind of, like, you live in the crevices of this administrative system that never explains anything to you, is incredibly annoying, and eventually kills you, or not. We
Yeah,
don't even
or not.
know,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on that point, because I also feel like, I mean, because look, I use AI for things, but like also I
Yeah.
feel like now half the time it's not really me using it. I'm forced to interact with it in terms of like customer service or other
Right.
kinds of
Interesting.
experiences, right? Where it's just like
Oh yeah.
it's,
God.
people have
Yeah.
been replaced with robots, but that is much more Kafkaesque, and like here I am trying
I
to
mean,
persuade like
Kafka
an
is like,
LLM,
talk about prescient.
like
Like, if
yeah,
you read The Castle, it's like that's exactly like what's being described there. But I do think I want to say one more thing about football, if it's okay, because like
yeah, go
I
You can
do
ahead.
think
say
like
all many things about
yeah.
football. Yeah.
Well, there was Netflix made this show a couple years ago called Quarterback,
Yeah.
and they followed through a whole season. It was Mahomes and Marcus Mariota and Kirk
Kirk
Cousins.
Cousins. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a scene in that really Kirk Cousins was using this app, and the app is like you put these electrodes on your head here, and then they plug into your phone, and the app on the phone plays like just like I don't know, like Law and Order or something, right? Just like a TV show. And if your attention flags at all for even a millionth of a second, the show just goes to black, and you have to refocus, and then it plays again, right? And the idea of this app is that it's training you to do subconscious level attention, to maintain your attention for a few minutes at this level that isn't in your awareness at all, on the assumption that on the field, the fact that, what is a quarterback doing? You take the snap and then you are processing a massive amount of information, which now is all datafied. So you're seeing it all the time, right? In 1.5 seconds less, right? And I think about that a lot because I think that like this isn't just AI. I think it makes it worse, but like the digital modeled world that we live in kind of forces us all to be quarterbacks in this way, where we're like in this like extreme state of like brain tension, you know, basically like extreme. So we're being trained to pay attention beyond what is like a normal human capacity. So, that feeling about being dragged down by customer service or whatever, it feels like that's part of the same thing. Like you're like, I'm humming. And then you hit the system that's just like,
Yeah.
just kind of drags you to hell in this way. And like, I think that that's in a way, I think that quarterbacks are like the prototypical intellectuals of the digital society. They're the men who we prize for being the smartest in this like moment to moment prediction economy, in this way that we all have to imitate at some level,
Yeah.
but the stakes are weirdly in our lives, the stakes are higher in a certain way than they are in a football game. It's just a game or whatever. They're also
Mhm.
lower because we're not doing it in front of hundreds of millions of people for million,
Yeah.
tens
Right.
of
Right.
millions,
Yeah.
hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's like a complete, I don't know. For me, like football it's a metaphor of American life in general.
Yeah. I agree 100%. I mean, that might have to be a future episode because I could do hours on
Me too.
that. Have you
Me
back.
too. Yeah.
Well, Leaf, thank you so much for coming by. This has been great.
Thanks for
I wish
having
we
me.
had
This
like
is
4
really
or 5
fun.
more
Yeah.
hours, but yeah, it's been awesome. So
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
thank
I
you.
feel like I learned a ton. That was amazing. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.